Our text for this week is Genesis chapter 50, verses 15 to 21. We've been going through the story of Joseph the past several weeks, and Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery in the land of Egypt. In Egypt, he moved from being a slave to second in command in all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. Through Joseph's leadership and his obedience to God, he was able to prepare for a time of famine, and thousands of lives were saved. As we get into our reading for today, Joseph has been reunited with his family, and immediately preceding our reading, Jacob, Joseph's father, passes away, and Joseph and his brothers bury their father. And that's where we pick up the story in Genesis chapter 50, verses 15 to 21. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I was about 6, maybe 7 years old, I don't remember. And my sister was probably about 8 or 9. And the two of us, we ended up in a bit of an argument. I don't really remember what it was about, and I doubt it was anything of importance. But she was making me mad, and as a 6-year-old, I figured that the best way to solve my problem was just to give her a little slug in the arm. So I did. And then there were waterworks. She was crying and screaming, and I honestly felt bad. So she runs into the house crying for my mom. "Andrew hit me! Andrew hit me!" Of course, my mom comes out, and I get in big trouble. And I was old enough to know not to hit. As my mom was giving me the lecture about how hitting was wrong and how bad it was that I had done that, Natalie was standing beside her with the tears just still in her eyes, just dripping down her face. And I apologized, and I'm sure I was grounded from something for a while. I think I got in pretty decent trouble. So then my mom heads back inside. And as soon as the door closes, Natalie has stopped crying. Now she has a big grin on her face, and she tells me, "That didn't really hurt. I just wanted to get you into trouble." Of course, conveniently, when I mentioned it a few months ago to her, she doesn't remember the story, but I remember. I remember quite well. It's really amazing how differently siblings act towards each other when their parents aren't around. When mom or dad are present, they're sweet little angels. But as soon as the children are left alone with each other, that's when the fangs come out. And that's what Joseph's brothers are afraid of. When their dad was around, Joseph was quite forgiving of the fact that they had sold him into slavery. In their minds, in Joseph's brothers' minds, he was probably a little too forgiving. How do you really forgive what Joseph's brothers had done to him? They beat him to a pulp. They threw him into a pit, and then they sold him into exile as a slave. These brothers, they cannot comprehend that Joseph had actually forgiven them, because that's not the way the world works. In the real world, you do bad things and you get bad things in return. It's an eye for an eye and it's a tooth for a tooth. And so it's difficult for them to believe that Joseph's goodness and generosity is anything more than a show to impress their father. So as soon as their father is dead, the brothers expect for Joseph's true feelings towards them to be revealed. And they are not optimistic about what those feelings will be. See, Joseph's brothers, they cannot recognize true goodness and forgiveness because they cannot see beyond their own sin. And I think this is perhaps one of the most damaging aspects of sin, is that sin has this way of shaping our imagination so that it becomes difficult to recognize what is still good in the world. Sin can distort the way in which a person sees the world so that goodness is thought to be simply a pretense for one's own selfish motives. We say, oh, you're only doing that because you get something out of it, you benefit in some way. Or they're only doing that because it makes them look good. And when I say things like that, in reality, the problem isn't out there. The problem is with my own sin and guilt that is keeping me from recognizing the true goodness in other people. And that's where we find Joseph's brothers. From the brothers' vantage point, they expect retribution from Joseph, because that's how the world works and operates. That's how they operate. Joseph was annoying them when he was a teenager, so they got rid of him. They beat him up. They sold him as a slave. And that solved the problem. No more annoying Joseph. You get what you deserve and what's coming to you. And because that mindset has so shaped their imagination, they end up projecting that mindset onto Joseph and assume that he must be that way as well. See, that's what sin does to us. It inhibits our ability to recognize goodness when we see it. But Joseph is not like his brothers. Joseph doesn't operate the way the rest of the world operates. When the brothers, when they try to send this really pitiful message to Joseph saying, oh, by the way, Dad told us to tell you that he wants you to forgive us. He commands you to forgive us. When Joseph hears that message, he weeps. He weeps. His brothers, they don't know him at all. And so he has to tell them twice, don't be afraid. He reminds them of the good that God has accomplished despite their evil intentions. And he promises to provide and take care of them and their families. So the final line of our reading tells us that Joseph comforts his brothers. He reassures them and speaks kindly to them. What kind of a story is this? Joseph's story begins with his brothers beating him, tossing him into a well, and selling him as a slave. And it ends with Joseph comforting his brothers. What do they need comfort for? Shouldn't this be the other way around? Shouldn't Joseph's brothers be comforting him? He was the one who was hurt. He was the victim. See, this story, it lies completely outside of our imagination of how our world deals with evil. The number one movie right now at the U.S. box office is the superhero movie Justice League. And I haven't seen it yet. I've heard it's not very good. But I can basically tell you right now that the plot of the movie is that the bad guy's going to come in, and he's going to want to take over the world for some evil purpose. And the good guys, they'll team up, and there's going to be this great fight, and the good guys will win. I know that because it's the plot of just about every other movie of its kind. Now, I haven't seen the film, again. I don't know if this is how it's going to play out, but it's a guess. But I'm pretty sure that the movie does not end with the Justice League comforting the bad guy. I've seen a lot of superhero movies in my life, and every one of them ends with the superhero taking down the villain through violent means. And of course, it's not just the superhero movies, it's the westerns. It's the mysteries. It's even the Christmas movies. Think about Home Alone. Home Alone does not end with Kevin comforting the bandits. So I can see the Hollywood version of Joseph's story. It would begin the same way. Joseph's brothers beat him to a pulp and sell him into slavery. But when they reunite, Joseph's response wouldn't be forgiveness. It'd be something like, "I'm back, suckers!" And then there'd be this great epic fight scene, boom, boom, boom. And Joseph would kick butt and he would take names before riding off in the sunset with the girl. Of course, I can see the last shot of the movie would be one of Joseph's brothers rising from the ashes to vow vengeance, just so they could set up for the sequel. There's just something that feels right when the bad guys get their comeuppance. We like to see the afflicted be comforted and the afflictors be afflicted. That's the imagination of how our world deals with evil. And the reality is that it's effective. It works more times than not. If Joseph's brothers, if they were paid back for their crime, I would imagine that they would probably think twice before selling someone else into slavery. And they couldn't sell anyone else into slavery if they were dead. See, retribution and violence is an effective way to deal with evil. I guarantee you, if driving slow in the fast lane was punishable by death, less people would do it. How do we often teach our kids to deal with a bully? Well, hit back. That'll work. And it often does. I can tell you from my own childhood experience, hitting back can work with a bully. Unless it's your sister, of course. But make no mistake about it. Repaying evil with evil is effective. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. It works. That's why the world lives by it. I took a class several years ago on the theology of the church. And in this class, we read a book by Craig Hovey. And the book was called To Share in the Body, a Theology of Martyrdom for Today's Church. And in this book, Hovey challenges the church today to not think of martyrdom as something of the past, but as a continuing aspect of the Christian faith and witness. And this is a book that I've honestly wrestled with ever since I first read it. I don't agree with everything that Hovey says with all of his arguments, but I'm challenged by it every time that I read it. And one of the things that Hovey says that I have to just continually chew on is he says, users of violence have abandoned their crosses for more effective means of achieving results. This is why it is important to see that it is not only the crosses that refuse violence, suffering it rather than inflicting it, but also that following Jesus is not a means of achieving something. Let me say the last part again. Following Jesus is not a means of achieving something. Here's what Hovey is saying. Violence and retribution is a lot more effective at achieving results than picking up a cross and following Jesus. Keep in mind, when Jesus tells his disciples, pick up your cross and follow me, he's not talking about the general challenges and difficulties in life. It's not, oh, you have your cross and I have mine. Jesus is talking about picking up a literal cross, a Roman tool of death and destruction. The emphasis is on cross rather than your cross. So Hovey is saying that striking back against the evildoer is more effective than picking up a cross and following Jesus. Because refusing to inflict violence may very well lead to suffering it. It's not effective. Following Jesus is not a means to an end. Carrying a cross and following Jesus may very well lead to suffering and death, martyrdom, rather than traditional understandings of success. In other words, where I'm going with all this is that the problem with retribution, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, is not that it is ineffective, but that it is not the Jesus way. The Jesus way is to forgive. The Jesus way is to turn the other cheek. The Jesus way is to do good for those who do us evil. The Jesus way is to comfort the afflicter. After all, is that not what Christ has done for us? Paul says in Romans 5, verse 8, that God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. See, it's central to our faith as Christians that God has not given us what we deserve. We have all sinned. We are all the afflictors. Jesus died on the cross, not just for us, but also because of us. And God responds to our affliction with forgiveness and comfort. Even as Jesus hung on the cross, he says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. So we who have experienced this radical forgiveness of God are called to show radical forgiveness to those who have sinned against us. Not because it's necessarily an effective way to deal with evil, though I believe it can be, but ultimately we do that because it is the Jesus way. That's why in Paul's letter to the Romans, after he describes that radical love and forgiveness we find in Jesus, he tells the church in chapter 12, verses 17 through 21, he says, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge. I will repay,' says the Lord." On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. The difference between Joseph and his brothers is that his brothers were so tainted by their own sin that they could not even recognize the goodness that Joseph had shown them. Joseph's response to their sin was outside of what they could imagine. But Joseph was able to recognize God's ability to bring good even out of evil. God's ability to overcome evil with good. So Joseph does not seek to repay evil for evil. He repays evil with good, because he knows that God can still bring good out of it. And so Joseph serves as an agent of God's goodness in a world seemingly overrun by evil. I'm not a pacifist, and I don't play one on TV. Truthfully, I'm not really interested in talking about pacifism. And if our focus in this just becomes a theoretical debate on pacifism, then we're missing the point. Questions about when violence is appropriate and acceptable probably don't impact most of our day-to-day lives. But here's what I wonder. I wonder if our imagination about how to deal with sin and evil is shaped more by the world than it is the kingdom of God. I wonder if, like Joseph's brothers, if our sin hinders us from recognizing all the good that's around us. I wonder if we're too quick to look for an effective way to deal with our problems rather than the Jesus way. And I don't believe those are always the same thing. I wonder what the world, or even on a smaller scale, the Yakima Valley, might look like if there was a people who responded to evil by seeking to bring about good from that evil before seeking the judgment of the evildoer. I wonder if there can be a place where the sinner can be comforted rather than condemned. Most of all, I wonder if that people and that place can be our church. As we set out in this study on Genesis, the question that had been and has been driving me is, what does it mean to be the people of God? In Genesis, we see a world overrun by evil and sin. And God's response to that problem, God's response to that evil, is to call a people who will be a blessing to the world. Now, God could have called Abraham and his family, or some other family, to be the ones who seek for the sinners to get what's coming to them. God could have called for some superhero team to kick butt and take names. They could have been the one who punished the evildoers so as to effectively make the sinners stop their sinning. But instead, what God does is he calls Abraham and his family to bless all peoples, to do good for all people, even the sinners. And in Joseph, we see a foreshadowing of blessings to come, as Joseph provides comfort and forgiveness to those who do not deserve it. God's act of creation came to a close, with God declaring that it was very good. And even with all the sin, the disobedience and evil that takes place all throughout Genesis, Joseph is still able to see that God is devising plans for good. God is not done with his creation. So in spite of all the evil that is at play, there is still plenty of good to see and work towards. The God who called creation into being is still calling his people to be his agents of redemption and to seek that redemption the Jesus way. So I believe that even to this day, God can look at his creation and declare that it is very good.